Abe Lincoln's Anecdotes and Stories by R.D. Wordsworth, Part 3. It was uphill work. 2 young men called on the president from Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln shook hands with them and asked about the crops, the weather, etc. Finally, one of the young men said, "Mother is not well, and she sent me up to inquire of you how the suit about the Wells property is getting on." Lincoln, in the same even tone with which he had asked the question, said, "Give my best wishes and respects to your mother, and tell her I have so many outside matters to attend to now that I have put that case and others in the hand of a lawyer friend of mine, and if you will call on him," giving name and address, "he will give you all the information you want." After they had gone, a friend who was present said, "Mr. Lincoln, you did not seem to know the young men." He laughed and replied, "No, I had never seen them before, and I had to beat around the bush until I found who they were. It was uphill work, but I topped it at last." His glass hack. President Lincoln had not been in the White House very long before Mrs. Lincoln became seized with the idea that a fine new barouche was about the proper thing for the first lady in the land. The president did not care particularly about it one way or the other, and told his wife to order whatever she wanted. Lincoln forgot all about the new vehicle, and was overcome with astonishment one afternoon when, having acceded to Mrs. Lincoln's desire to go driving, he found a beautiful barouche standing in front of the door of the White House. His wife watched him with an amused smile, but the only remark he made was, "Well, Mary, that's about the slickest glass hack in town, isn't it?" Could lick any man in the crowd. When the enemies of General Grant were bothering the president with emphatic and repeated demands that the silent man be removed from command, Mr. Lincoln remained firm. He would not consent to lose the services of so valuable a soldier. "Grant fights," said he in response to the charges made that Grant was a butcher, a drunkard, an incompetent, and a general who did not know his business. "That reminds me of a story," President Lincoln said one day to a delegation of the Grant is no good style. "Out in my state of Illinois, there was a man nominated for sheriff of the county. He was a good man for the office, brave, determined, and honest, but not much of an orator. In fact, he couldn't talk at all. He couldn't make a speech to save his life. His friends knew he was a man who would preserve the peace of the county and perform the duties devolving upon him all right, but the people of the county didn't know it. They wanted him to come out boldly on the platform at political meetings and state his convictions and principles. They had been used to speeches from candidates and were somewhat suspicious of a man who was afraid to open his mouth. At last the candidate consented to make a speech, and his friends were delighted. The candidate was on hand and, when he was called upon, advanced to the front and faced the crowd. There was a glitter in his eye that wasn't pleasing, and the way he walked out to the front of the stand showed that he knew just what he wanted to say. "Feller citizens," was his beginning, the words spoken quietly, "I'm not a speakin' man. I ain't no orator, and I never stood up before a lot of people in my life before. I'm not going to make no speech except to say that I can lick any man in the crowd." No deaths in his house. A gentleman was relating to the president how a friend of his had been driven away from New Orleans as a Unionist, and how, on his expulsion, when he asked to see the writ by which he was expelled, the deputation which called on him told him the government would do nothing illegal, and so they had issued no illegal writs, and simply meant to make him go of his own free will. "Well," said Mr. Lincoln, "that reminds me of a hotel keeper down at St. Louis, who boasted that he never had a death in his hotel, for whenever a guest was dying in his house, he carried him out to die in the gutter." Lincoln's name for weeping water. "I was speaking one time to Mr. Lincoln," said Governor Saunders of Nebraska, "of a little Nebraskan settlement on the Weeping Water, a stream in our state." "Weeping Water?" said he. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he continued, "I suppose the Indians out there call it Minneeboohoo, don't they? They ought to, if Laughing Water is Minnehaha in their language." Easier to empty the Potomac. An officer of low volunteer rank persisted in telling and retelling his troubles to the president on a summer afternoon when Lincoln was tired and careworn. After listening patiently, he finally turned upon the broad Potomac in the distance, said in a peremptory tone that ended the interview, "Now, my man, go away, go away. I cannot meddle in your case. I could as easily bail out the Potomac River with a teaspoon as attend to all the details of the army." A free-for-all. Lincoln made a political speech at Pappsville, Illinois, when a candidate for the legislature the first time. A free-for-all fight began soon after the opening of the meeting, and Lincoln, noticing one of his friends about to succumb to the energetic attack of an infuriated ruffian, edged his way through the crowd, and seizing the bully by the neck and the seat of his trousers, threw him, by means of his strength and long arms, as one witness stoutly insists, 12 feet away. Returning to the stand and throwing aside his hat, he inaugurated his campaign with the following brief but pertinent declaration. "Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am. I am humble Abraham Lincoln. I have been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of the national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments. If elected, I shall be thankful. If not, it will be all the same." The other one was worse. It so happened that an official of the War Department had escaped serious punishment for a rather flagrant offense by showing where grosser irregularities existed in the management of a certain bureau of the department. So valuable was the information furnished that the culprit who gave the snap away was not even discharged. "That reminds me," the president said, when the case was laid before him, "of a story about Daniel Webster when the latter was a boy. When quite young at school, Daniel was one day guilty of a gross violation of the rules. He was detected in the act and called up by the teacher for punishment. This was to be the old-fashioned feruling of the hand. His hands happened to be very dirty. Knowing this, on the way to the teacher's desk, he spit upon the palm of his right hand, wiping it off upon the side of his pantaloons. 'Give me your hand, sir,' said the teacher very sternly. Out went the right hand, partly cleansed. The teacher looked at it a moment and said, 'Daniel, if you will find another hand in this schoolroom as filthy as that, I will let you off this time.' Instantly from behind his back came the left hand. 'Here it is, sir,' was the ready reply. 'That will do,' said the teacher. 'For this time you can take your seat, sir.'" Could make rabbit tracks. When a grocery clerk at New Salem, the annual election, came around, a Mr. Graham was clerk, but his assistant was absent, and it was necessary to find a man to fill his place. Lincoln, a tall young man, had already concentrated on himself the attention of the people of the town, and Graham easily discovered him. Asking him if he could write, Abe modestly replied, "I can make a few rabbit tracks." His rabbit tracks proving to be legible and even graceful, he was employed. The voters soon discovered that the new assistant clerk was honest and fair, and performed his duties satisfactorily, and when, the work done, he began to entertain them with stories, they found that their town had made a valuable personal and social acquisition. Peter Cartwright's description of Lincoln. Peter Cartwright, the famous and eccentric old Methodist preacher who used to ride a church circuit, as Mr. Lincoln and others did the court circuit, did not like Lincoln very well, probably because Mr. Lincoln was not a member of his flock, and once defeated the preacher for Congress. This was Cartwright's description of Lincoln. "This Lincoln is a man 6 feet 4 inches tall, but so angular that if you should drop a plummet from the center of his head, it would cut him 3 times before it touched his feet." Wished the army charged like that. A prominent volunteer officer who, early in the war, was on duty in Washington and often carried reports to Secretary Stanton at the War Department, told a characteristic story on President Lincoln. Said he, "I was with several other young officers, also carrying reports to the War Department, and one morning we were late. In this instance, we were in a desperate hurry to deliver the papers in order to be able to catch the train returning to camp. On the winding, dark staircase of the old War Department, which many will remember, it was our misfortune, while taking about 3 stairs at a time, to run a certain head like a catapult into the body of the President, striking him in the region of the right lower vest pocket. The usual surprised and relaxed grunt of a man thus assailed came promptly. We quickly sent an apology in the direction of the dimly seen form, feeling that the ungracious shock was expensive, even to the humblest clerk in the department. A second glance revealed to us the president as the victim of the collision. Then followed a special tender of 10,000 pardons, and the president's reply, "One's enough. I wish the whole army would charge like that." Uncle Abraham had everything ready. "You can't do anything with them Southern fellows," the old man at the table was saying. "If they get whipped, they'll retreat to them Southern swamps and bayous, along with the fishes and crocodiles. You haven't got the fish nets made that'll catch 'em. Look here, old gentleman," remarked President Lincoln, who was sitting alongside, "we've got just the nets for traders, in the bayous or anywhere. Hey, what nets? Bayou nets." And Uncle Abraham pointed his joke with his fork, spearing a fishball savagely. Didn't trust the court. In one of his many stories of Lincoln, his law partner W.H. Herndon told this as illustrating Lincoln's shrewdness as a lawyer. "I was with Lincoln once and listened to an oral argument by him in which he rehearsed an extended history of the law. It was a carefully prepared and masterly discourse, but, as I thought, entirely useless. After he was through and we were walking home, I asked him why he went so far back in the history of the law. I presumed the court knew enough history. 'That's where you're mistaken,' was his instant rejoinder. I dared not trust the case on the presumption that the court knows everything. In fact, I argued it on the presumption that the court didn't know anything, a statement which, when one reviews the decision of our appellate courts, is not so extravagant as one would at first suppose." Tad got his dollar. No matter who was with the president, or how intently absorbed, his little son Tad was always welcome. He almost always accompanied his father. Once, on the way to Fortress Monroe, he became very troublesome. The president was much engaged in conversation with the party who accompanied him, and he at length said, "Tad, if you will be a good boy, and not disturb me any more until we get to Fortress Monroe, I will give you $1. The hope of reward was effectual for a while in securing silence, but boy-like Tad soon forgot his promise and was as noisy as ever. Upon reaching their destination, however, he said very promptly, "Father, I want my $1." Mr. Lincoln looked at him half reproachfully for an instant, and then, taking from his pocketbook a $1 note, he said, "Well, my son, at any rate, I will keep my part of the bargain." Rough on the Negro. Mr. Lincoln one day was talking with the Reverend Dr. Sunderland about the Emancipation Proclamation and the future of the Negro. Suddenly a ripple of amusement broke the solemn tone of his voice. "As for the Negroes, Doctor, and what is going to become of them, I told Ben Wade the other day that it made me think of a story I read in one of my first books, Aesop's Fables. It was an old edition, and had curious rough woodcuts, one of which showed 3 white men scrubbing a Negro in a potash kettle filled with cold water. The text explained that the men thought that by scrubbing the Negro they might make him white. Just about the time they thought they were succeeding, he took cold and died. Now I am afraid that by the time we get through this war, the Negro will catch cold and die." Long Abe's feet protruded over. George M. Pullman, the great sleeping car builder, once told a joke in which Lincoln was the prominent figure. In fact, there wouldn't have been any joke had it not been for Long Abe. At the time of the occurrence, which was the foundation for the joke, and Pullman admitted that the latter was on him, Pullman was the conductor of his only sleeping car. The latter was an experiment, and Pullman was doing everything possible to get the railroads to take hold of it. "One night," said Pullman in telling the story, "as we were about going out of Chicago, this was long before Lincoln was what you might call a renowned man, a long, lean, ugly man with a wart on his cheek came into the depot. He paid me 50 cents, and half a berth was assigned him. Then he took off his coat and vest and hung them up, and they fitted the peg about as well as they fitted him. Then he kicked off his boots, which were of surprising length, turned into the berth, and undoubtedly having an easy conscience, was sleeping like a healthy baby before the car left the depot. Pretty soon along came another passenger and paid his 50 cents. In 2 minutes he was back at me, angry as a wet hen. "There's a man in that berth of mine," said he hotly, "and he's about 10 feet high. How am I going to sleep there, I'd like to know? Go and look at him." In I went, mad too. The tall, lank man's knees were under his chin, his arms were stretched across the bed, and his feet were stored comfortably for him. I shook him until he awoke, and then told him if he wanted the whole berth, he would have to pay $1. "My dear sir," said the tall man, "a contract is a contract. I have paid you 50 cents for half this berth, and as you see, I'm occupying it. There's the other half," pointing to a strip about 6 inches wide. "Sell that and don't disturb me again." And so saying, the man with the wart on his face went to sleep again. He was Abraham Lincoln, and he never grew any shorter afterward. We became great friends, and often laughed over the incident. I'd been missed by myself. The president did not consider that every soldier who ran away in battle, or did not stand firmly to receive a bayonet charge, was a coward. He was of opinion that self-preservation was the first law of nature, but he didn't want this statute construed too liberally by the troops. At the same time, he took occasion to illustrate a point he wished to make by a story in connection with a darky who was a member of the 9th Illinois Infantry Regiment. This regiment was one of those engaged at the capture of Fort Donelson. It behaved gallantly and lost as heavily as any. "Upon the hurricane deck of one of our gunboats," said the president in telling the story, "I saw an elderly darky with a very philosophical and retrospective cast of countenance, squatted upon his bundle, toasting his shins against the chimney, and apparently plunged into a state of profound meditation. As the Negro rather interested me, I made some inquiries, and found that he had really been with the 9th Illinois Infantry at Donelson, and began to ask him some questions about the capture of the place. 'Were you in the fight?' 'Had a little taste of it, sah.' 'Stood your ground, did you?' 'No, sir, I runs.' 'Run at the first fire, did you?' 'Yes, sah, and would have run sooner, had I knowed it war comin'.' 'Why, that wasn't very creditable to your courage.' 'Das isn't my line, sah. Cooking's my profession.' 'Well, but have you no regard for your reputation?' 'Reputation's nothing to me by de side of life.' 'Do you consider your life worth more than other people's?' 'It's worth more to me, sah.' 'Then you must value it very highly.' 'Yes, sah, I does. More dan all dis world, more dan $1,000,000 ob dollars, sah, for what would dat be wuth to a man wid de breath out ob him? Self-preservation de first law wid me.' 'But why should you act upon a different rule from other men?' 'Different men set different values on their lives. Mine is not in the market.' 'But if you lost it, you would have the satisfaction of knowing that you died for your country.' 'Dat no satisfaction when feelin's gone.' 'Then patriotism and honor are nothing to you?' 'Nothing whatever, sah. I regard them as among the vanities.' 'If our soldiers were like you, traitors might have broken up the government without resistance.' 'Yes, sah, dar would have been no help for it. I wouldn't put my life in the scale against any government dat ever existed, for no government could replace the loss to me.' 'Do you think any of your company would have missed you if you had been killed?' 'Maybe not, sah. A dead white man ain't much to these soldiers, let alone a dead nigger, but I'd 'a missed myself, and that was the point with me.' I only tell this story," concluded the president, "in order to illustrate the result of the tactics of some of the Union generals who would be sadly missed by themselves, if by no one else, if they ever got out of the army. Lost his certificate of character. Mr. Lincoln prepared his first inaugural address in a room over a store in Springfield. His only reference works were Henry Clay's Great Compromise speech of 1850, Andrew Jackson's proclamation against nullification, Webster's great reply to Hayne, and a copy of the Constitution. When Mr. Lincoln started for Washington to be inaugurated, the inaugural address was placed in a special satchel and guarded with special care. At Harrisburg, the satchel was given in charge of Robert T. Lincoln, who accompanied his father. Before the train started from Harrisburg, the precious satchel was missing. Robert thought he had given it to a waiter at the hotel, but a long search failed to reveal the missing satchel with its precious document. Lincoln was annoyed, angry, and finally in despair. He felt certain that the address was lost beyond recovery, and, as it lacked only 10 days until the inauguration, he had no time to prepare another. He had not even preserved the notes from which the original copy had been written. Mr. Lincoln went to Ward Layman, his former law partner, then one of his bodyguards, and informed him of the loss in the following words. "Layman, I guess I have lost my certificate of moral character, written by myself. Bob has lost my gripsack containing my inaugural address." Of course, the misfortune reminded him of a story. "I feel," said Mr. Lincoln, "a good deal as the old member of the Methodist Church did when he lost his wife at the camp meeting, and went up to an old elder of the church and asked him if he could tell him whereabouts in H—L his wife was. In fact, I am in a worse fix than my Methodist friend, for if it were only a wife that were missing, mine would be sure to bob up somewhere." The clerk at the hotel told Mr. Lincoln that he would probably find his missing satchel in the baggage room. Arriving there, Mr. Lincoln saw a satchel which he thought was his, and it was passed out to him. His key fitted the lock, but alas, when it was opened, the satchel contained only a soiled shirt, some paper collars, a pack of cards, and a bottle of whiskey. A few minutes later, the satchel containing the inaugural address was found among the pile of baggage. The recovery of the address also reminded Mr. Lincoln of a story which is thus narrated by Ward Layman in his Recollections of Abraham Lincoln. The loss of the address and the search for it was the subject of a great deal of amusement. Mr. Lincoln said many funny things in connection with the incident. One of them was that he knew a fellow once who had saved up $1,500 and had placed it in a private banking establishment. The bank soon failed, and he afterward received 10% of his investment. He then took his $150 and deposited it in a savings bank, where he was sure it would be safe. In a short time, this bank also failed, and he received at the final settlement 10% on the amount deposited. When the $15 was paid over to him, he held it in his hand and looked at it thoughtfully. Then he said, "Now darn you, I have got you reduced to a portable shape, so I'll put you in my pocket." Suiting the action to the word, Mr. Lincoln took his address from the bag and carefully placed it in the inside pocket of his vest, but held on to the satchel with as much interest as if it still contained his certificate of moral character. The case of Betsy Ann Dougherty. Many requests and petitions made to Mr. Lincoln when he was president were ludicrous and trifling, but he always entered into them with that humor-loving spirit that was such a relief from the grave duties of his great office. Once a party of Southerners called on him in behalf of one Betsy Ann Dougherty. The spokesman, who was an ex-governor, said, "Mr. President, Betsy Ann Dougherty is a good woman. She lived in my county and did my washing for a long time. Her husband went off and joined the rebel army, and I wish you would give her a protection paper." The solemnity of this appeal struck Mr. Lincoln as uncommonly ridiculous. The two men looked at each other, the governor desperately in earnest, and the president masking his humor behind the gravest exterior. At last Mr. Lincoln asked with inimitable gravity, "Was Betsy Ann a good washerwoman?" "Oh, yes, sir, she was, indeed." "Was your Betsy Ann an obliging woman?" "Yes, she was certainly very kind," responded the governor soberly. "Could she do other things than wash?" continued Mr. Lincoln with the same portentous gravity. "Oh, yes, she was very kind, very. Where is Betsy Ann?" "She is now in New York and wants to come back to Missouri, but she is afraid of banishment." "Is anybody meddling with her?" "No, but she is afraid to come back unless you will give her a protection paper." Thereupon Mr. Lincoln wrote on a visiting card the following: "Let Betsy Ann Dougherty alone as long as she behaves herself. A. Lincoln." He handed this card to her advocate, saying, "Give this to Betsy Ann." "But, Mr. President, couldn't you write a few words to the officers that would ensure her protection?" "No," said Mr. Lincoln, "officers have no time now to read letters. Tell Betsy Ann to put a string in this card and hang it around her neck. When the officers see this, they will keep their hands off your Betsy Ann." Fooling the people. Lincoln was a strong believer in the virtue of dealing honestly with the people. "If you once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens," he said to a caller at the White House, "you can never regain their respect and esteem. It is true that you may fool all the people some of the time. You can even fool some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all of the people all the time." her only imperfection. At one time, a certain Major Hill charged Lincoln with making defamatory remarks regarding Mrs. Hill. Hill was insulting in his language to Lincoln, who never lost his temper. When he saw his chance to edge a word in, Lincoln denied emphatically using the language or anything like that attributed to him. He insisted, a high regard for Mrs. Hill, and the only thing he knew to her discredit was the fact that she was Major Hill's wife. He broke to win. A lawyer who was a stranger to Mr. Lincoln once expressed to General Linder the opinion that Mr. Lincoln's practice of telling stories to the jury was a waste of time. "Don't lay that flattering unction to your soul," Linder answered. "Lincoln is like Tansey's horse. He breaks to win." Bap McNabb's Rooster. It is true that Lincoln did not drink, never swore, was a stranger to smoking, and lived a moral life generally, but he did like horse racing and chicken fighting. New Salem, Illinois, where Lincoln was clerking, was known the neighborhood around as a fast town, and the average young man made no very desperate resistance when tempted to join in the drinking and gambling bouts. Bap McNabb was famous for his ability in both the raising and the purchase of roosters of prime fighting quality, and when his birds fought the attendance was large. It was because of the flunking of one of Bap's roosters that Lincoln was enabled to make a point when criticizing McClellan's unreadiness and lack of energy. One night there was a fight on the schedule, one of Bap McNabb's birds being a contestant. Bap brought a little red rooster, whose fighting qualities had been well advertised for days in advance, and much interest was manifested in the outcome. As the result of these contests was generally a quarrel, in which each man, charging foul play, seized his victim, they chose Lincoln umpire, relying not only on his fairness, but his ability to enforce his decisions. Judge Herndon, in his Abraham Lincoln, says of this notable event, "I cannot improve on the description furnished me in February 1865 by one who was present. They formed a ring, and the time having arrived, Lincoln, with one hand on each hip and in a squatting position, cried, 'Ready!' Into the ring they tossed their fowls, Bap's red rooster along with the rest, but no sooner had the little beauty discovered what was to be done than he dropped his tail and ran. The crowd cheered, while Bap, in disappointment, picked him up and started away, losing his quarter, entrance fee, and carrying home his dishonored fowl. Once arrived at the latter place, he threw his pet down with a feeling of indignation and chagrin. The little fellow, out of sight of all rivals, mounted a woodpile, and proudly flirting out his feathers, crowed with all his might. Bap looked on in disgust. "Yes, you little cuss," he exclaimed irreverently, "you're great on dress parade, but not worth a darn in a fight." It is said, according to Judge Herndon, that Lincoln considered McClellan as great on dress parade, but not so much in a fight. Lincoln's first speech. Lincoln made his first speech when he was a mere boy, going barefoot, his trousers held up by one suspender, and his shock of hair sticking through a hole in the crown of his cheap straw hat. Abe, in company with Dennis Hanks, attended a political meeting, which was addressed by a typical stump speaker, one of those loud-voiced fellows who shouted at the top of his voice and waved his arms wildly. At the conclusion of the speech, which did not meet the views either of Abe or Dennis, the latter declared that Abe could make a better speech than that, whereupon he got a dry goods box and called on Abe to reply to the campaign orator. Lincoln threw his old straw hat on the ground and, mounting the dry goods box, delivered a speech which held the attention of the crowd and won him considerable applause. Even the campaign orator admitted that it was a fine speech and answered every point in his own oration. Dennis Hanks, who thought Abe was about the greatest man that ever lived, was delighted, and he often told how young Abe got the better of the trained campaign speaker. Too many pigs for the teats. An applicant for a sutlership in the Army relates this story. In the winter of 1864, after serving 3 years in the Union Army and being honorably discharged, I made application for the post sutlership at Point Lookout. My father being interested, we made application to Mr. Stanton, the Secretary of War. We obtained an audience, and were ushered into the presence of the most pompous man I ever met. As I entered, he waved his hand for me to stop at a given distance from him, and then he put these questions, viz: Did you serve 3 years in the army? I did, sir. Were you honorably discharged? I was, sir. Let me see your discharge. I gave it to him. He looked it over, then said, Were you ever wounded? I told him yes, at the Battle of Williamsburg, May 5th, 1861. He then said, I think we can give this position to a soldier who has lost an arm or leg, he being more deserving. And he then said I looked hardy and healthy enough to serve 3 years more. He would not give me a chance to argue my case. The audience was at an end. He waved his hand to me. I was then dismissed from the august presence of the Honorable Secretary of War. My father was waiting for me in the hallway, who saw by my countenance that I was not successful. I said to my father, Let us go over to Mr. Lincoln. He may give us more satisfaction. He said it would do me no good, but we went over. Mr. Lincoln's reception room was full of ladies and gentlemen when we entered. My turn soon came. Lincoln turned to my father and said, Now, gentlemen, be pleased to be as quick as possible with your business, as it is growing late. My father then stepped up to Lincoln and introduced me to him. Lincoln then said, Take a seat, gentlemen, and state your business as quickly as possible. There was but one chair by Lincoln, so he motioned my father to sit, while I stood. My father stated the business to him as stated above. He then said, Have you seen Mr. Stanton? We told him yes, that he had refused. He, Mr. Lincoln, then said, Gentlemen, this is Mr. Stanton's business. I cannot interfere with him. He attends to all these matters, and I am sorry I cannot help you. He saw that we were disappointed, and did his best to revive our spirits. He succeeded well with my father, who was a Lincoln man, and who was a staunch Republican. Mr. Lincoln then said, Now, gentlemen, I will tell you what it is. I have thousands of applications like this every day, but we cannot satisfy all for this reason, that these positions are like office seekers. There are too many pigs for the teats. The ladies who were listening to the conversation placed their handkerchiefs to their faces and turned away, but the joke of old Abe put us all in a good humor. We then left the presence of the greatest and most just man who ever lived to fill the presidential chair. More pegs than holes. Some gentlemen were once finding fault with the president because certain generals were not given commands. The fact is, replied President Lincoln, I have got more pegs than I have holes to put them in. Few but boisterous. Lincoln was a very quiet man and went about his business in a quiet way, making the least noise possible. He heartily disliked those boisterous people who were constantly deluging him with advice and shouting at the tops of their voices whenever they appeared at the White House. These noisy people create a great clamor, said he one day, in conversation with some personal friends, and remind me, by the way, of a good story I heard out in Illinois while I was practicing, or trying to practice, some law there. I will say, though, that I practiced more law than I ever got paid for. A fellow who lived just out of town, on the bank of a large marsh, conceived a big idea in the money-making line. He took it to a prominent merchant and began to develop his plans and specifications. There are at least 10 million frogs in that marsh near me, and I'll just arrest a couple of carloads of them and hand them over to you. You can send them to the big cities and make lots of money for both of us. Frogs' legs are great delicacies in the big towns and not very plentiful. It won't take me more than 2 or 3 days to pick 'em. They make so much noise my family can't sleep, and by this deal I'll get rid of a nuisance and gather in some cash. The merchant agreed to the proposition, promised the fellow he would pay him well for the 2 carloads. 2 days passed, then 3, and finally 2 weeks were gone before the fellow showed up again, carrying a small basket. He looked weary and done up, and he wasn't talkative a bit. He threw the basket on the counter with the remark, There's your frogs. You haven't 2 carloads in that basket, have you? Inquired the merchant. No, was the reply, and there ain't 2 carloads in this blasted world. I thought you said there were at least 10 million of 'em in that marsh near you, according to the noise they made, observed the merchant. Your people couldn't sleep because of 'em. Well, said the fellow, According to the noise they made, there was, I thought, 100 million of them, but when I had waded and swum that there marsh day and night for 2 blessed weeks, I couldn't harvest but 6. There's 2 or 3 left yet, and the marsh is as noisy as it uster be. We haven't catched up on any of our lost sleep yet. Now you can have these here 6, and I won't charge you a cent for 'em." "You can see by this little yarn," remarked the president, "that these boisterous people make too much noise in proportion to their numbers." End of section 3.